We're up to the fifth Perek in the Pirkei Avot, in the ethics of our fathers. Now, the fifth Perek is different than all the other Perakim. All the other chapters goes along to teach us different lessons. It goes through different Tanaim, and each Tana has a different lesson that he tries to give over and tries to impart on everybody. Comes along the fifth chapter, and the fifth chapter goes along with numbers more. Plays more of a numbers game. It starts off by Asara Mamarot Nivra Olam. With 10 sayings, the world was created. That means God created the world with 10 sayings. And if you count in the Parshat Bereshit, each time it says Vayom Vayom Vayomer, and there's one time equals 9, and the first saying is Bereshit. Which we'll get to in a minute. Why does he have to tell us this? God could have created the world in one saying. Why do you have to split up into 10 sayings? Rather, it's to pay up from the Rishaim, from the wicked people that are destroying a world that is created with 10 sayings, and to give reward the tzaddikim, to the righteous people, that they are keeping the world going. A world that was created with 10 sayings. Now, how do we understand this Mishnah? As follows. God really could have created the world in one saying. Could have created all one shot. You can ask, what about Shabbat? On the seventh day, he could have went ahead and rested. But there's a reason why he didn't. If he would have created in one saying, in one shot, the entire world, all at one, with everything in it, all in one shot, a couple of things would have been lacking. But the Shmuel brings down, others bring down. Number one would have been lacking the fact to show man that you are the epicenter of the world. The whole point of the world is man. How did God show that the entire point of the world is man? By the fact that he created everything before he created man. He created everything in the 6 days of creation, in the 6 days of creation, and the last of the creations was man. Why? Because he prepared everything for man. He built the house, he built everything in the house, all the furniture, everything's all set. For who? From the man who's going to come and live there. So that's how he showed man that the entire world was created for man. That's one of the reasons why he split it up into 10 sayings. He split it up into so many multiple days. And now that you are the epicenter of the world and the whole world is created just for you, so that means what you do has a big effect on the world. Because the whole world is there for you and only you. Like the Nefesh HaChaim brings down, right? The soul is really refers to 3 parts. It's called nefesh, neshama, ruach, and nefesh, right? Nefesh, ruach, and neshama. There are 3 parts to the soul. The nefesh is basically who you are. It's in you. The ruach, right? V'yipa v'apav nishmat chayim, right? The wind, which is also there, but it's on a slightly higher level. Then there is the neshama. The neshama part is what fully attaches you to high above, to God. Each one of these things are attached to the next. So when a person sins, he could be messing up his nefesh, but the top of the nefesh is connected to the ruach. And now, generally, the main part of a person that he messes up is the nefesh, not really the ruach. If a guy goes that bad and he's also messing up his ruach, it's still attached on top to the neshama. So the person is always still attached. He's never fully cut off from up on above. And it's like strings. Every single person is like strings between him and the one above, him and all the way up, through all the worlds, basically. And based upon your actions, you're either messing everything up through that string, or you're fixing everything through that string. So therefore, when a tzaddik does something good, he's not just fixing up himself, he's fixing up the entire world, because you're one with the entire world. And when a person does sin, he's not just messing himself up, he's messing up the entire world. Now, if God would have created the world that was one saying, once that one thing you would have been messed up, there'd be no more world. The world would have had to be destroyed. It would have had to have been. Because you went ahead and you messed up that one thing that's there. But now that it's made up with 10 sayings, Asara Mamarot, so now there's a much longer time span. You have to destroy much more in order to get rid of, to destroy the world, Chas v'shalom aleinu. And that, as we know, never happened, right? It's not going to happen like we're going to see in the next Mishnah. But also, he has to pay up. Now that this world is made with 10 sayings, so it's like the thing is worth now $100 instead of $1, right? Instead of $10. So now, if the Rasha ruins the world, he has to pay up more. And if the Tzaddik fixes the world, he gets more because he went ahead and he's fixing the world. The Kerem Matzir brings down from his father-in-law that I wanted to give it an analogy. We brought this down once to the world being like a stained window pane. You know, the stained glass. Right? So it's made up, if you ever saw one of those nice stained glass windows, it's made up of many little windows. Right? It's all little windows. If you go ahead and you take one big window and you draw the picture on it, what would it be? You throw a rock at it, the whole window is broken. But if the window is made up of many smaller windows, you throw a rock at it, all the other panes are still in existence. And that's the difference between one ma'amar, the world being created, and asara ma'amarot, the world being created. I wanted to add on one more thing though. If the world was just created in one day, right, in one ma'amar, then you would have only probably had midat hadin. Because when Hashem created the world, the first day of Yom Echad, there was only midat hadin, only judgment. There was no rachamim involved, and therefore the world would not have been able to exist without rachamim because of man's sin. Because as we said, the Rishayim, you needed a second day. You needed to make more than one in order for there to be a midah of rachamim, a midah of compassion in this world, and therefore he went ahead and he split it up into 10 saints. Now, just to end off on this Mishnah. The Mabit, the Holy Mabit in the Sefer Beit Elokim brings down regarding prayer. Right, the whole argument regarding a regular mitzvot. Do mitzvot need kavanah? Do they need thought process? Or do they not need kavanah? Do they not need thought process? Now we find when it comes to Shmoneh Esrei, the Amidah, you need to have kavanah at least the first bracha. If you don't have kavanah, if you don't understand what you're saying, you're not thinking about what you're saying, at least in the first paragraph of the Amidah, you're not Yotze Amidah really. You're not really Yotze Tefillah. Why? Why is it that Tefillah, unlike everything else, needs, according to everybody, that thought process? So the Mabit brings down a Chidush. The Mabit says that the 10 sayings that God said to create the world were not actually said. Like, you know, like the question is, if there's nobody to hear it, is there actually a noise? You know, when somebody chops down a tree in a forest, do you hear the tree falling, right? When God said, did he actually speak? Was there actually a call, a noise coming out? So the Mabit says no. The Mabit says that the Amirah, the 10 sayings that are brought down in the creation of the world, were actually the thought of God. His ratzon, his want, his will. And that's what formulated the world. When he said, Vayhi, there should be light, it was a thought. There should be light. And he said we find similar things. He brings it down from the Sfarim that are on Megillat Esther, that it says, Vayomer Haman b'libo. Haman said in his heart. So you see that there could be a speech, which is not actually a speech that comes out of your mouth. That's all in here. So therefore, Tefillah, the prayer, we're not going to go through the whole Mabit, but prayer, which is connecting to God in that essence by showing that he created everything, and therefore he's the only one who can really help me, and therefore I'm just letting him know what all my issues are. For that, you need to have kavanah. You have to use that power of machshava, that power of thought besides speech. You need the speech also, us human beings. We need that speech as well. We're not going to go into it why. But you need that machshava for that particular reason he brings down. And we actually one time brought down from the level yo, okay, it popped in my head. One time brought down from the level yo, that a neshama, the way a neshama talks, we mentioned neshama before, the way neshama talks is also through machshava. It doesn't talk through dibur, it talks through machshava, which actually fits very well with the Mabit, in which his explanation of Amirah, of speech, in its pure spiritual settings, also refers to the machshava, the thought process of man. Now that we established that God created the 10 sayings in order for the world to exist much longer and not to be destroyed by one person's sin because it's in a get rid of that one saying. Now comes in the next Mishnah, which also the Medrash Shmuel brings down so beautifully. It goes very well together with it, because it says Asara Dorot me Adam ve'ad Noach. There were 10 generations from Adam, the first man, till Noach. Lo'odiyah, to show you kama erech hapayim lefanav, how long suffering God is. God holds back his anger. Shekol Dorot, all those generations, hoyu machasin uva'in, all the generations were provoking God. They did bad to God. They tried to provoke God. We'll explain it soon why. Until God brought the Mabul. How many generations? 10 generations. Why 10 generations? Because God created the world with 10 sayings as a magician. He created with 10 sayings. And therefore, each generation basically was crumbling each one of those sayings. And therefore, for there to be one saying, the world would have to have been destroyed. It would have to be a Mabul. And if nobody was in existence to survive the Mabul, the world would have been destroyed. But he was so long suffering because he created with 10 Amirot, with 10 sayings. Therefore, it was 10 generations. The 10th generation of Noach. Noach could not save his entire generation. Noach served God miyirat, through fear. And he didn't go out to bring people closer. But he was Tamim. He was Noach Matzachem Ben Elokim. He was able to save himself and his family. Therefore, they were saved, and the whole world really had to be destroyed. Even the top layer of the world was destroyed as well. But Asara Dorot, there was another 10 generations afterwards. Min Noach v'ad Avraham, from Noach to Avraham. All the generations were provoking God. You see the difference in Noach and Avraham. Noach, he was a Mabul. He didn't get the reward from all the previous generations because he couldn't hold their sins either. There had to be a cutoff from all the previous generations. Avraham Avinu, he had such a love for God, first of all. Avraham was a Avah, he served God with love. But more than that, he went around trying to bring people close to God. He went around trying to show everybody else God. And he was so great, he was able to basically absorb into himself all the Averot. He was able to counteract all the Averot of all the previous generations. And therefore, he got the reward from all those people onto him. Now, why did they sin? And what were their sins? So we find that their sin that they sinned was they started with Avodah Zarah. Who started Avodah Zarah? We mentioned this once. The Enosh. Enosh started to serve Avodah Zarah. Now, why? What was the beginning? How did they? Everybody knew about God. What caused them also to start serving idols? So he said the reason was because in his generation, he and others, they decided we're not worthy enough to serve God directly. Now, God has all these legions, all these tzvakot, he has all these constellations and all these stars. There's all these things going on. All these angels in charge of different things. We're going to start serving his ambassador. It's like you act nicely to the ambassador in order to, the ambassador will intercede with you and the king because I'm not worthy enough to speak straight to the king. That's where it started from. Until they forgot about God and they started just serving the idols. Others remembered about God, but they decided that God only created the world, but he no longer ran the world. He gave over the running to his underlings to run it, and he takes the seat back. He's sipping martinis in Aruba, yeah? That's the way another group of thought was. And I mentioned this once a couple of weeks ago, that they actually, historically, they found there was a fellow who was shipwrecked in one of these islands, one of the Solomon's Islands, and he found these people. These were people that didn't know anything of anything. But they all believed that there had been a creator, but he no longer ran the world. So you see that there was already such a thought process. You see, even these primitive people who live in the middle of nowhere, no connection to the rest of the world. You see this form of Avodah Zarah exists. Now, what caused them to forget about God? So the Midrash brings down, what caused them was because life was too easy for them. They had everything extremely easy. They were extremely tall. They were able to walk across the world without any problems, without anything getting in their way. The woman would give birth in a day. Basically, the kid, once she gave birth, the kid was already able to walk and talk and do everything right away. There was no child process like we have now, where a child slowly getting older. And there's a whole story between a child and a demon. We don't have time to talk about it. Right? As the child was still attached to the umbilical cord to his mother, he went to go get something for his mother. It was an entirely different world. People were different. The world was different. The entire world, the entire year was spring weather. You didn't have the different seasons. The crop just came up by itself, basically. Yeah, you needed to plant once. It was a whole different world. And because they had so much gold and silver was brought down, they had so much of everything, they forgot about God. Who needs God? That's the way they looked at it. Who needs God? I have everything. I have everything. It's like the people say, yeah, as long as God doesn't mix in, my business is going to go good, yeah? That's the person who has everything good and he forgets about God because he has everything. He starts believing in himself. And that's how the Dora Mabul, the generation before the destruction of the world, and the Mabul, that's how they thought. Since they had so much, and that's why even when Noach was threatening them, the water's going to come, they figured they're going to put the feet on top of the holes. Yeah, the big people, the giants. They put the feet on top of the holes, and the water's not going to come up. Not say they didn't know that there was a God that existed. Sure. But they don't need him. As long as he mixes out, everything's fine. And that insanity, which comes from Ga'ava, in essence, was an insanity we found again by Bar Kochba, Kozba. When he went ahead and he did his rebellion against the Romans, and Rabbi Akiva and the others, they held that he was Mashiach, they held, that he could be Mashiach, and he was fighting these battles and he was always winning. And then the other Kutim, the Idumim, they decided they wanted to join together with his army. And Rabbi Akiva says, no, we don't need, keep it a Jewish army. Forget about all the noms, you don't need all of them. And he basically he said, no. He says, as long as God doesn't mix in, we'll win the wars. And that's when he started losing everything. Went to his head. That's Gava. That's the Gava. That's what happens when life is completely perfect. Everything is exactly perfect and you have everything, you forget about God. You don't start fixing. That's why people, from then on, different things started, the world started going down. People stopped living as long. People stopped, life became harder. Because sadly, through hardship, we find God. Kara alai moed, right? By Av, the month of Av, Tisha B'Av, Kara alai moed, it's called a holiday. Why is it called a holiday? Why is it called the moed? Gifted Zasal explains because it's a gathering in which you find God. Sadly, we see God, we find God in the good times. When everything's amazing, we can find God. And if people don't find God when it's amazing, sadly, God brings them the hard times. And then they find God. No. Even Abraham Avinu, first man, that we just explained that he served God with love. And he was so powerful that he was able to keep the world to the previous 10 generations before him, that it should be standing and staying, and he got the reward from all of them on him. He was tested 10 times. Asara nisyonot nisnasa Abraham Avinu. He didn't have an easy life. 10 trials and tribulations. But he withstood all of them. Lord, to let you know, the love, how great was the love of Abraham Avinu? Now the question is, what were the 10 trials? What were the 10 nisyonot that Abraham was testing? There are different counts of what they are. Some start from when Hashem told Abraham Avinu, Lech lecha me'artzecha, that was the first test. And from there you have the Ra'av in Eretz Yisrael, there's this Sarah being taken by Paro, the battles of the 4 kings against the 5 kings, the Brit Milah, the marriage to Hagar, Avimelech taking Sarah, having to send away Hagar, having to send away Ishmael, and Akedat Yitzchak. Now everybody agrees that Akedat Yitzchak is the last one. Others say that it really starts from before Lech lecha me'artzecha. Because we have to remember, Abraham Avinu, when he was 3 years old already, even though it says he was 40 when he recognized God, when he was 3 years old, he was already looking for God. Right? One point says he recognized God at 3, one says he's 40. Some say his journey started at 3 and he reached here at 40. But he was already, at 3 years old, he was already going ahead and finding God. And he was a massive force. And Nimrod took him and threw him into jail. Nimrod took him and threw him into jail. There's others, there's Midrashim that bring down that they were actually sitting there when Abraham Avinu was born. And based on astrology, they figured out that Abraham Avinu was going to be an issue, and they wanted to kill him as a baby. But either way, they took him, they threw him into prison, and he was still having Talmidim. He still had so many students from being in prison. Right? You find somebody in prison is able to have such a massive effect. So Nimrod decided to go ahead and basically have a talk with him and throw him into the Kivshan, throw him into the hot fiery furnace. And Abraham was saved. Some count that as being the first one. Some count the fact he was in jail as being the first one. They count those. The question is, according to those that don't count those, why not? So one answer that's brought down is because the fact that he was willing to give up his own life for something he believed in was not such a big thing. The other things, right? The fact that he's able to, everything else went against his way of life. But to give up for something you believe your life in, that's something that it was some sort of brain function that it makes sense to. But if you know that it was the first of the trials, why is it not brought down in the Torah? It's not brought down in the Torah. Lech Lecha is brought down in the Torah. Beforehand, what happened was not brought down in the Torah. Why not? So the reason I heard once, I'm trying to remember from who, I believe it's from Rosh, I don't remember exactly from who, was because obviously there were two sides of the conversation. Between Abraham and Nimrod, there had to be two sides of the conversation. And if the Torah is going to bring down the conversation, it's going to have to mention Nimrod's side. Or even if it says the Abraham's side of the conversation, Nimrod's side that people are going to figure out on their own. Once you start thinking about the other side's point, it could go into your mind and you can start having doubts on your own if you're not on the level. Therefore, it's not brought down in the Torah. Same way when the son of the Brisker Rav, who was of the Brisker Rav, he came to him and asked him, Shalom Mora Nevuchim, yeah, the Rambam's big sefer on philosophy, right? Mora Nevuchim. He asked him if they should read it, and his father said, no, you shouldn't read it. You shouldn't read it. He says, why not? He says, because the Rambam wrote it for people who had questions based on philosophy, and to answer up their questions, he wrote the sefer. You don't know philosophy, so you don't have any of these questions. So why put these questions in your head on the hopes that his answers you're going to be happy with? I mean, don't put questions in your head. It's not worth it. And that's why it's brought down. Pirkei Avot, it's brought down other places. A person should only argue with somebody only if you actually know the answers, right? Only if you've already thought through it. But don't go along and try to have somebody asking questions on your faith if you don't have a way of answering, and that guy's questions might go ahead and affect you. There's no reason to bring it in. That's why the Torah does not say it according to that view. Now, the Nisyanot of Avraham Avinu, we mentioned once before from the Sephorna that in Nisayon, Yisurim, is in Lashon that God shows you the kochot and the strength you have. And that's what we say. Anything that the forefathers, they were able to overcome, anything that they went through, Pirkei Avot, Siman Lebanim, they gave us the ability and power to be able to withstand different things that happen in our lifetime because we have that in our bloodstream from Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Now, once we're still on the number 10, it continues the number 10 for a bit. And it goes on that 10 miracles were performed for our forefathers in Egypt and 10 by the ocean. Now, what does this have to do with the previous Mishnah? I know all the number 10. What is it? What's the connection? So it's brought down the connection because Avraham Avinu, we just said that the actions of the forefathers, they are siman to the banim. Remember, Avraham Avinu was able to fix the previous 10 generations before him, and also impart this number 10, this power of 10 to the future generations. And therefore, in his chut, basically of that 10, which corresponds to the 10 mamarot shenivra olam, we had 10 miracles by the Yam Suf and 10 miracles in Egypt. Now, what were the 10 miracles? There were 10 miracles in Egypt and 10 by the sea. The 10 by the sea, as we all know, the water divided. It split up like tents with canopes, and the floor was dry. When the Egyptians wanted it turned muddy. The sea divided into 12 parts. The water became hard like stone, but when they were thirsty, they would bring in and they were able to drink, and it became like congealed. Afterwards, it hardened again. It was like congealed bricks. And you were able to see the other tribes, and the ground didn't get wet underneath their feet. These are the great miracles that happened by Kriyat Yam Suf. Now, there were also 10 makot on the same number 10 and the same koach that we got from, remember the 10 saying that the world was created with. Now, Abraham went ahead and harnessed, and that we have it. We also have the Esar Makot, the 10 plagues that HaKadosh Baruch Hu brought on the Mitzrayim, 10 by Esar Layam and 10 by the ocean. And everybody knows the 10 Makot, down to the day of Kingdom of all the Makot, everybody understands. But what we saw by the 10 makot was midah keneged midah. This attribution of God in which he punishes the person based upon the person's actions themselves. God uses you as a template for yourself. We mentioned last week, God is the shadow, right? The shadow of man, basically, right? You pick up your hand, God picks up his hand opposite, right? It's the shadow. He treats you equal to how you, it's equal force. That's midah keneged midah. And that was the 10 makot that happened, one of the greatest things that came out of there. Right? So if we saw God, we saw that God runs the world, right? We had that patachon, that we got that faith in God. But more than that, we also see the midah keneged midah of how God runs everything. Right? The blood in the river turned to blood, right? They caused us to bleed. The Nile River was the sustenance of all the didn't rain in Egypt. It was the sustenance of everything in Egypt, and it turned into the blood. And Pharaoh used to throw the babies into the water, also symbolized the blood. All that was symbolized in blood. And so on and so on. We don't have time to go through all the makot, but every single one of the makot, each one was there to show this thing of midah keneged midah. And we're left with a saying in the Torah, right? One who keeps the Torah, you follow the Torah. If a person wants a chorol, basically, if one keeps and follows the Torah, then all the machalot, all the terrible afflictions that happened in Egypt will not happen to a person. Meaning, if somebody doesn't learn Torah, doesn't keep Torah, does not stay in Torah, the exact opposite will end up happening. They want to say, Ki ani Hashem rofecha. I am Hashem, your healer, right? Who is the healer? Who is the doctor of all? Who's the doctor? We say, it's not the doctor you go in. It's not him. He's not the one who heals you. Who is the healer of man? God is the healer of man. The doctor is a shaliach. The doctor is a messenger of God. But if God wants somebody to live, somebody's going to live. No matter what the prognosis the doctor gives. But God doesn't just heal the physical. He also heals the spiritual. I believe you mentioned this once, right? If you see somebody, sadly, has bad midot, somebody doesn't act nice, somebody who has issues, what do you do for them? You pray for them. You pray that God should heal them. That's why the hiratzon in the prayer is what? It says, we always say refuat nefesh or refuat aguf. We don't just say refuat aguf or refuat for the soul. Refuat nefesh or refuat aguf. Somebody who's perfectly healthy, but he has a problem with his soul. His soul's cold to Judaism. The guy's a horrible, he's a nasty person. He gets very angry. What should you do for such a guy? Don't hate him. Never hate. Never hate anybody. Pray for him. Pray for him. Because God is the healer. God is the doctor. The same way you can pray for somebody to get healed physically, you have to pray for somebody to get healed spiritually as well. And it's very important to pray for somebody else's spirituality. Very important. And that's why every single time we ever pray for somebody, always cholim for the nefesh for the aguf. Goes together. Always goes together. Now we have to realize, though, we also tested God. The same way God tests us, we also went ahead and we tested God. And that's Mishnah Zayin. Mishnah Zayin says, Asara nisyonot nisu avotenu et HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'midbar. There were 10 trials where we tested God. We, the Jewish people, including the Egel. That we tested God, we tried him 10 times and we didn't listen to him. 10 times. You have to understand where it was that we tested him. We were in the Midbar, surrounded by the Anani Kavod, with man falling from the heaven, being led by Moshe Rabbeinu. We had everything. Goes back to the second Mishnah when we mentioned why people started before the Mabul, why people did Averot, why they stopped serving God. When a person has everything, they start complaining. Now, that's not to say that there weren't times that we didn't have everything, right? The first time we complained, the first time we tested, we truly didn't have everything, right? We went in there and we were missing this, that. We were. So what was the test of God? We didn't have full faith in Him. We didn't have full bitachon in Him. We didn't have full reliance on Him. And by the ego we mentioned once, we always have to mention that one. By the ego we mentioned one, what was the sin then? Right? Only the Erev Rav sinned then. A lot of the time that we tested God in the Midbar was not the regular Jewish people. It was the Erev Rav, a lot of it. Right? And it says whenever you have problems, Jewish people making a lot of problems, they're the Erev Rav in every generation. They still exist. And the Jewish people still suffer from them. But what was the Chet of the Egel again? You just have to repeat it this one time, quickly. The Chet of the Egel was that we all sat there quietly. The Erev Rav served the Egel, they all served this calf, and we sat there and didn't say a thing. Only one person said something. And he gets killed, he was stoned to death. Nobody else stood up afterwards. Nobody said anything. Nobody said anything. And that's a problem. That's one of the big issues. One of the big issues, if you show you have faith in God, you believe in God, you rely on God, everything God. Well, what happens when you have to stand up for God? That's the test. You always want God to be there for you. And He's always there for you. Always there for you. Always. God's everywhere. He was with Chaim. I believe it was Chaim Soloveitchik. His son was the Brisker Rav, yeah? Now the Brisker Rav is called Velvel. Yitzchak Zev. Zev is a wolf, which is Velvel. And he was a boy then. Now the halacha brings down that if you want to make a zimun, if you have two adults and you have one person under the age of bar mitzvah, but he knows to who it is that he's saying Bechat HaMazon, he's on the level, intellectually, he can be counted. So his father wanted to see if he's on the level, if he could bring him in to be a third. So he had turned to his son and he asked him, I'll give you a gold coin if you tell me where God is. You know what the kid answered? The kid answered, I'll give you 100 coins if you show me where God is not. A 6-year-old kid. Yeah, I'll give you 100 coins if you tell me where God is not. God's everywhere. The whole world only exists because of God. The table only stands because of God. God is in everything. God is everywhere. God is everything. And we always want God to be there for us and stand up for us. The test is, do we stand up for God? Do we stand up and defend God? And that was the chet of the Egel. That was the chet that we did by the Egel, says that we sat by quietly. Why did we sit by quietly? We made thoughts. And all our thoughts were negative thoughts. We all thought that the guy next to us agreed with what they're doing, and therefore if I say something, he's going to say, thoughts. Don't make thoughts when it comes to God. When it comes to God, you get up and you defend God. Whatever it's going to be, is going to be. He runs everything. Defend him. You can never lose by defending him. And that's a lot of the Nisyonot, a lot of the problems that we had in the Midbar, the 10 trials and tribulations. A lot of them were done by the Erev Rav. Yet it's put on the entire Jewish people because we sat quietly, or because we joined in, or for whatever reason. We accepted Lashon Hara by the Meraglim. And even then, there was a machshava by the Meraglim also, that a machshava, why they're doing it, a good reason. Machshavot don't come into anything. When it comes to God, it's all action, it's all doomed. All doomed. We're going to end off with this last Mishnah that we're going to do it with now. We'll go through it quickly, we don't have time to go through it in detail. We'll end off with the Beit HaMikdash. There were 10 miracles that happened to our forefathers in the Beit HaMikdash, and Bezrat Hashem will happen again this week, when Mashiach comes. Number one, Lo Hipila Isham Reach HaKodesh. They will bring kabbanot. And now generally, if somebody smells something, and they get very hungry, and you really need it, and a pregnant woman especially needs it. That's why even Yom Kippur, if she smells something and she wants it, you're supposed to tell her it's Yom Kippur, and she says, even though I need it, you give it to her to eat. It's dangerous otherwise. A woman never miscarried from the smell of the kabbanot. And you remember Jerusalem in the summers gets pretty hot. Israel gets pretty hot in the summer. And yet the meat in the Beit HaMikdash never spoiled. And sometimes the meat can be sitting there for hours. For hours. You had holidays where it could sit. There was never a fly. There was never a fly in the butcher house in the Beit HaMikdash where they slaughtered the animals. You have to understand something. That's one of the signs of Kedusha. A person who's Kadosh doesn't have bugs in his house. Right? It's how the Gemara brings down. That's Shinu al Yohanavi. That's how Shinu he was holy because there was no zvuv in the house. Elisha. That's how Shinu Elisha was the holy person because there was no flies in the house. Right? There's a famous story we brought that once from Abel Penzach. When he moved to a different yeshiva, he was in one yeshiva, then he moved to a different yeshiva in Israel. He was very old, in his high 80s, and he had a young man who would stay with him, take care of him. And when he moved, the guy went back to go get something. And when he went back into the house, he found the house was full of cockroaches and jukim and all these things. The house was full of bugs. The only reason why there was no bug, he said all the years the Rebbe Lapin lived there, there'd never been a bug or fly in the house. Second he left, it was full of bugs and flies. That's Kedusha. Rebbe Lapin was one time sitting by a shiur in Kfar Hasidim, and the shiur, Rebbe Noach Shemanavit Zatzal, he was giving shiur, and there were flies everywhere, and they were swatting the flies. And he stopped the shiur and he said, look at Rebbe Zatzal. Everybody has flies flying around them except for him. Sign of Kedusha. Now we find the first Mishnah in Yuma. You have a second Kohen Gadol on the Yom Kippur. You have a Skan Kohen Gadol, a vice president, so to speak, a vice Kohen Gadol, in case the Kohen Gadol becomes Tameh. Never happened. The Kohen Gadol never became Tameh by Yom Kippur. And the fire that was on the Mizbeach never went out. And not just the fire that came down from heaven, but even when the fire didn't come down from heaven, or even the other fires that were on the Mizbeach, they never went out from rain. There was a pillar of smoke used to go up, the wind never moved it. Wind was blowing, it didn't move. They didn't find any psul in any of these lechem apanim, or the 2 loaves of bread brought on Shavuot, or the omer brought on Pesach. When they stand in the Beit HaMikdash Yom Kippur and by the Yom Tovim, they would stand there, they would be cramped. Remember, hundreds of thousands of people cramped in. But when it came to them to bow down, they would bow down flat on the ground. Straight flat. Everybody had massive area. Why? Because again, room, space, everything is God. Space is not the way it has to be. You could technically fit more into a space if God wants it to be. And in the entire Jerusalem, not just the Beit HaMikdash, the entire Jerusalem, a snake or a scorpion never went ahead and hurt somebody or killed somebody. Nobody said it's too narrow for me to find a place to stay in Jerusalem. That's just some of the things that went on in the Beit HaMikdash. You see Kedusha, you see holiness. When there's holiness involved, when the wind comes, wind, smoke is supposed to go away, rain is supposed to put out fire. All the things are supposed to happen. According to what? According to what we envision in our mind as being nature. But nature doesn't have to be that way. As we mentioned other times, when a person has bitachon, a person on plastic, when a person on a certain level. God runs the world. And when God wants rain to put out fire, it puts out fire. But when God does not want rain to put out fire, it won't put out fire. When God does not want smoke to be blown by wind, it won't blow it away. Right? You have meat, maggots come out of meat if you leave meat out. Bugs are formed from within the meat itself. It didn't happen in the Beit HaMikdash because God didn't want it to happen there. Every single thing that happens in this world is all from God. And that's the lesson from this. and with his kedusha, with his holiness, none of that happens. Bezrat Hashem, we zochet to the bias Mashiach, which it says when Mashiach comes, there's the Ev, where everything will be able to coincide together nicely. That means the way of the world that we view it as right now is not going to be the same in that way. Animals are not going to kill each other. People are going to be in peace. Imagine such a thing, people in peace. Never existed. Never existed. Right, that was one of the big claims that when they made the big disputation between the Ramban and the days of Ramban by King James, he did the disputation of Barcelona. So the Ramban answered back, so he says, if this is what you consider after the Messiah, it says a time of peace. All the wars that happened since then, all the crusades at that time was going on, the bloodshed, that's your peace. That's your times of Messiah. That makes no sense. We know the time when the real Mashiach comes. That's peace. All these things in our mind, oh, this guy hits it, it's all going to cease because everybody's going to recognize God. Everybody's going to realize God. Everybody's going to understand that there's a God. And we'll all put our faith in Him. And Bezrat Hashem will all be zocheh, hopefully soon, to see that Bezrat Hashem this week.